Do you conduct a business in the Plenty Valley or surrounding area? If so, consider Plenty Valley FM 88.6 for your business promotion. Our rates are reasonable and results positive. Call 9404 2111 during business hours for more information.
Welcome to the podcast series Spaced Out Down Under, hosted by author, journalist Eden White and journalist broadcaster Denise Kuchma. Spaced Out Down Under aims to give a voice to astrophysicists, cosmologists and others in the physics and astronomy field to share their research and discoveries about what's happening in the cosmos. Episode 3 explores research in the life cycle of black hole neutron star mergers. And we're talking to Evgeni Grishin, postdoctoral research fellow at the School of Physics and Astronomy at Monash University in Victoria. He's also an associate investigator with OSGRAV, the ARC's Centre of Excellence for Gravitational Wave Discovery. Dr. Grishin's interests are in theoretical astrophysics, planetary science, stellar dynamics, and high-energy astrophysical phenomena. Dr. Grishin has had many papers published and won numerous awards. Dr. Grishin grew up in Israel, where he completed his PhD. Evgeni, welcome to our podcast series. What circumstances led you to Australia and Monash University for your postdoctoral research?
Yeah, hi everybody. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here on this podcast. And initially Israel is a very small country relatively. We have only like 4-5 universities. And normally it is expected, if you want to go back to do like a postdoctoral research somewhere overseas. And, I was just applying to various places and I had an offer here and I really liked the department and the people and the type of science is done in the country itself. So I decided to take it.
Eden.
Jenny, welcome. Your research follows the life cycles of mergers of black holes and neutron stars. It's a very fascinating area and a new area, I would suggest. How do you classify the differences between the neutron stars and the life cycles of black holes? Simply. All right. Yeah. So I think initially we have to kind of do the cycle and kind of see what could be the typical channels. So initially, stars are basically born from some clouds of gas that eventually collapse and bounded by gravity. And it becomes so hot and dense until eventually, if you have enough mass, then this gas, which is usually has hydrogen and helium, starts to burn in a nuclear fusion reactions. And the typical time scale of the evolution and also the final fate of these stars is primarily depend on its mass. So, for example, if you take like lower mass stars like our sun, it will evolve for a few billions of years, but eventually it will kind of shed its outer layers and become into what we call as a white dwarf. It's basically just the inner core of the star that remained bound, and it's just like a core of like roughly the size of the Earth that basically cools very slowly. If you take a star which is more massive, maybe 10 times the mass of the sun, for example, it will have various stages of stellar evolution and nuclear burning until eventually you will able to, because the gravity is stronger, eventually you will be able to form a more compact object, which is called a neutron star. In general, we classify these end state of stellar evolution to basically, we call them compact objects because they have a lot of their mass, roughly the mass of the sun, maybe a bit more, but they are confined into a much smaller space. So, the sun has the sun is quite big. I think its radius is 100 times the radius of the Earth, roughly. The radius of a white dwarf is roughly it has roughly the size of the Earth, but it has the mass of the sun, roughly, in it. Well, for a neutron star, it still has the same mass, but it's actually much more compact. It has typical radius of 10 kilometers, something like that. So they're really small. It's basically the size of Melbourne, in some sense, maybe even smaller. While for a black hole, you need very massive stars, typically above 20-something solar masses. It's a bit uncertain to most, but in general, the more massive your star is, the more likely it is to end up eventually as a black hole following some kind of very energetic supernova explosion, which will leave this remnant black hole.
How different might binary star systems be?
Yeah, that's an excellent question because initially I've described basically the life cycle of one star. We talked only about the internal processes that occur in its interior, basically the evolution of the elements and etc. But if we actually go to observations, actually many of the stars we see are actually in a binary system, meaning that you have like two stars orbiting each other in a bound orbit, like basically the Earth revolves the sun, but more massive. And then you have, a different. You can ask different questions. You can maybe look on the demographics or the statistics of the orbits. Are they tight? Are they wider orbits on much longer periods? Are the orbits circular? Maybe they have some ellipticity. Maybe they're more eccentric. And what is the mass ratio between the two stars? So now you have this. You have an orbit. You have like much more degrees of freedom. So you can ask these questions, kind of classify these orbits and see how they affect the evolution. And in addition, if you have two stars that just happen to be passing by each other, but maybe not colliding, but still passing by, they could have some interaction between them. Maybe you could have some tidal evolution that maybe can affect some of the properties. Maybe they can shed some mass and transfer the mass into the other star. So these things also can happen, which could affect eventually its evolution and final fate.
Now, all these differences, how are binary star systems classified?
Yeah, so I think it kind of relates to the previous question. I mean, you can look on the orbits and you can kind of classify them as basically very tight binaries that maybe...
I thought they might have had a name or something, this is called this sort of classification and this is a B classification.
Yes, if you have like stars, you can classify individual stars by their masses or by their spectral type, for example, because I think each mass has different luminosity, it has different properties of the light, so you can kind of infer the mass of individual stars from their spectrum.
Yeah.
Also, if you have an orbit, you can also kind of probe the orbital period. So some stars could have some binaries could be in very tight orbits, some of which eventually will interact as the stars will evolve. Other binaries they just kind of very far apart and they just kind of evolve without too much interaction.
Eden.
If you could explain a little bit about your research on classification of the stars and also the approaches and the tools that you use.
Okay, yeah. So as I said, I think I'm mostly focusing on binary stars. Yep. Namely, I mean, if you have like stellar science, you can focus on the evolution that happens inside of the star, as we mentioned earlier. Maybe it's a neutron star eventually or a black hole. I mean, we have to go into the details. I'm doing more of like what could happen to an orbit of a star by some external perturbation. For example, most stars are actually born in like stellar clusters or associations that you have like increased number density of these objects in space, and sometimes a third star or something else could pass by and change the orbit during its evolution, and eventually it can also affect the overall evolution and the final fate of the system. So a lot of the attention has been devoted to basically ask, okay, what happens to stars or binary stars or in general in what's called dense environments, and by dense I mean that you have a much larger number density of some objects or maybe some gas around, which is not present in our neighborhood. Just to give you an example, I mean, the closest star to us is, I think, Proxima Centauri. It's roughly a parsec away, which is quite far. It takes the light roughly like 5 or 10 years to go back and forth. And if you're in the center of a big cluster of stars, for example, that we know that they're there, it's going to be like 1,000 times more compact, roughly. So it is orders of magnitude of enhancement in density, in number density. So you are more prone to have these close encounters that will change your orbital evolution and subsequently also the interior evolution.
So the tools that you're using, is it radio astronomy or visual astronomy to do these assessments that you need? What do you use?
We have data from observations, so we have this data publicly available. I'm not actually working on the observations themselves.
Okay.
I mean, you have telescopes, you have Gaia, you have Juno, you have plenty of surveys, so data is quite public, some of it. You can use it and you can kind of look for some trends. I'm mainly doing computer simulations, basically kind of code up what I think is right for the system, have some model of the equations that describe the evolution of the stars and their environment, and let it run in a supercomputer, and then analyze the data to the models and kind of see if the assumptions are good, if it explains the observations, if you can predict something new, and etc.
So these stars, to my understanding, they're about 95% of stars are in the main sequence area. Do you know when you divide up a star exploding or a supernova ending up in a black hole, or how many percent end up in a black hole, how many percent end up in a neutron star? Is there any data on this?
Yeah, so first of all, it's a bit uncertain because we have to kind of assume something on the distribution of the mass that stars are born with. It's something that we call the stellar mass function, for example. And it generally has the properties that it's kind of like, we call it a power law. Basically, it means you have much more lower mass stars than high mass stars. It's kind of, you have like 1% of the people that have very high income, but most of the people actually have maybe like a median income. So it's kind of like this kind of distributions which are not symmetrical. So therefore it means you'll have much more lower mass stars than high mass stars. And as we mentioned, you need to be like at least roughly 9-10 solar masses to be a neutron star, and even further to be a black hole. And the fractions really depend on what is the initial distribution of stars, of the mass of the star. So I think if you just take the Milky Way for an example, so I think roughly, if you just have we have some rough estimates. So for example, for the Milky Way, we have 10 to the 11 rough stars, like the main sequence stars, and which are like 95% of, as you mentioned. We think we have like 10 to the 9-ish white dwarf stars, which are basically very old stars that weren't massive enough. They just evolved into a white dwarf. And I think for neutron stars, we have like maybe 100 million, like 10 to the 8 stars, roughly. Yeah. It's all like rough estimates, right? And for the black hole, it's like maybe a few million. So we have this kind of hierarchy of scales between. So yeah, because in order to form a black hole, you need to be very massive.
Another scale that I'm familiar with, you've got the population 3 stars, which obviously are from the Big Bang. They tend to have less or virtually no metallicity within the star. Are you looking at population 1 stars, with similar to our star, or population 2? What's the target of your research?
I think it's quite broad, but it really depends, where you are and what you see. In addition to the stars and the orbits, there's a thing that's called the metallicity. Basically, it means how much elements heavier than helium we have, like all the rest. And in the solar mass stars, I think it's population 1, which means that they're formed relatively recently. In astronomy, 5 billion years ago is quite recently. And these kind of stars that are similar to our sun, usually found in the disk of the galaxy. You also have different populations that usually found, in the outskirts of the galaxy, and maybe in these old globular clusters, which are generally old, that have much less metals. They have maybe like 100 times less metals than the sun has, for example. And there's also another ingredient of kind of like a subclass, which is called the population of 3 stars, and these are believed to be the first stars that were formed while the universe was young, and therefore to be very massive, and they kind of died also very fast, and eventually formed the first elements. But we don't see individual stars. We think we know that they should be there because they're shaping the evolution of our universe.
What seems to be fascinating is the orbit dynamics of these binary stars. They're rotating around each other. Is there a specific orbit, or is it variable?
I think it depends on how strong your outer perturbation is. So if you go back to Kepler's laws, we have the Earth, we have the Sun. We kind of know to predict when it's hot, when it's cold. We know where the sunrise and sunset is going to be. So our orbit is very predictable. But if you're in a dense environment and you have like higher probability of encounters, or also if you're in a very peculiar orbit, then you could, over some longer timescales, you could have some significant changes in the initial orbits of the stars, which eventually could be quite eccentric, meaning they have like a very close passage during the orbit, which eventually could affect them. So yes, the orbits are, because the environment is dense, you have much more perturbation applied on the orbit, and it could become dynamically active.
What methodology do you use to collect and analyze all this data?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, we have a lot of data coming as we speak, every day there's so much data on binary stars. Every day there's plenty of papers. So hopefully people writing papers that summarize their main results. and their pipelines. And also, I run models in a computer, so we have like pipelines for analysis, like the data that comes from that computer. And we're kind of trying to, to see if we're like on the right path and maybe adding some new features that we're developing. So it's just like any type of research, I guess.
So your data you're accessing is basically research data that's already published. Can you access data coming from current papers that are not published at this stage that is interesting data? Can you access that?
Yeah, so some data is published, some of it is still like work in progress, but I don't really generate like observational data. It's more like data from like computer simulations, which is, it's a toy model of the universe in some sense.
So what have you found so far? What's coming through the data?
Yes, I think one effect is actually quite interesting. So if you just focus on the Earth-Moon system, for example, Earth-Sun-Moon, it's a triple system, and the moon has some small inclination, which is, we know to predict the eclipses, like thousands of years forward, it's kind of predictable. But if you like take the moon and have like and make it like perpendicular to the orbit, it will actually could collide with the Earth just because of some other effects. Triple stars, for example, if you have like, some inner binary and maybe some very outer companion, then eventually over time, you could actually enhance the eccentricity of the inner companion and induce like stellar interactions. I think that's one effect I've been working out recently in the past.
The type of things you're finding out, how is this going to benefit mankind overall, do you think?
That's a good question. I think every research, even if it's fundamental, it eventually, you can't really predict what will happen, in some times because, because you're developing some technologies that you use maybe for research, but eventually they propagate eventually into the industry. I can name a few examples, but they're really like a bit out of astronomy.
I have a wild question for you. Last question, Evgeni, thank you. We know that Andromeda is roughly about 4.8 billion years away from colliding with our system. When it does collide, do you think stars within the system would be separated or will there be collisions? Will dark matter have something to do with it? Dark energy have something to do with it? How do you see the future billions of years from now when the two galaxies collide?
Yes, I don't want to comment about dark matter and stuff. I can talk about the dynamics of stars, for example.
Okay.
So we know that galaxies merge in the past. We see this kind of like their imprints of merged galaxy. That's maybe we think how galaxies grow. And at least for the Andromeda, when you say that the galaxies collide, is actually maybe the nuclei becoming bound, but eventually the probability of collisions of stars in the galaxy is actually quite low because the stars are quite tiny compared to the size of the galaxy. Yeah. So we'll just kind of whiz through and
just embrace each other.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
And there's a lot of space out there. That's why they call it space. We could just, drift on through, but I would suggest that probably gravitational waves will affect things in quite a dramatic way as the galaxies pass through each other. With all your projects and your research and your networks that you've built up while you've been in Australia, do you think you might stay permanently?
Yeah, well, I surely hope so. I just hope, that there'll be some jobs available. So, so we have collaborators and networks, and it's going well. So, we'll never know, but hopefully,
Keep knocking on doors.
Yes.
Dr. Grishin, thank you for your valuable contribution to the podcast series, Spaced Out Down Under, and we wish you the very best for your future discoveries. That was Dr. Evgeni Grishin talking to us about research in the cycles of black hole neutron star mergers.
I love the local news.
I love the music variety.
And all the local sport.
24 hours a day, it's all local. 88.6 Plenty Valley FM.